thank you so much for joining us today for the author talk for a new and exciting resource, a guide to practitioner research in international education. Again, my name is Chad Gaydon and I work in NAFSA's Professional Learning Services. And I'll be behind the scenes today helping you out as our great presenters are here to talk with you. Publishing a guide to practitioner research in international education was a collaborative effort between NAFSA and the International Education Association of Australia, IEAA. Both NAFSA and IEAA have several programs and events throughout the year to highlight research in our field. We hope everyone can join us for NAFSA's IEW Campus Connection in a few weeks and the Fall 2020 Research Symposium on Friday, November 20th. So with that, I'm going to turn off my mic and turn it over to our presenters.
Hello everyone and welcome. Wherever you are in the world, we hope that you are well, staying safe, and really pleased that you chose to join us today. My name is Ann D'Angelo. I am the Assistant Dean of Global Initiatives at the Carlson School of Management, which is the business school at the University of Minnesota. And it is my pleasure to lead this event today. In my daily job, I lead the Carlson Global Institute, which drives our business school's institutional strategy, institutional partnerships, education abroad programs, and global executive MBA programs. I also am an adjunct faculty member, and I serve on several dissertation committees in our College of Education and Human Development. And about 4 years ago, I became a certified leadership coach. I had the honor of serving as the 2018 chair of NAFSA's Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship Knowledge Community. So I wanted to give a Go TLS out there for all my colleagues and friends, and if anyone's interested in joining TLS or any of the other knowledge communities, feel free to reach out. Happy to share my experience. Joining me today are the co-authors of a guide to practitioner research in international education, Professor Christopher Ziguras and Dr. Shanna Saubert. Chris is the Research Director for IEAA, the International Education Association of Australia, and Associate Dean of Global and Language Studies at RMIT University in Melbourne. He supports international engagement across RMIT's social sciences disciplines and is active in research on cross-border higher education. He was also the president of IEAA from 2015 to 2018. It's good to see you, Chris. Welcome. Shanna is the Associate Director of Research and Scholarship at NAFSA. She organizes biannual research symposium events, edits the research symposium series and Trends and Insights pieces, and moderates the Research Connections online network. It's good to see you, Shanna, and welcome. They will join me for a discussion and provide a brief overview of the new guide, and then we will transition to answer questions from you, the audience around the world. So, are you ready, Chris and Shanna? I have the first question here. Please tell us about yourselves and how you became involved in international education and first got started.
Use that, Shanna. Thank you, Ann. Regarding how I got started in international education, it really started when I studied abroad as an undergraduate student. But my path towards research in international education just continued because I had questions about the experience and how different students have different experiences when they go abroad. So that really pivoted my journey towards the research area. And I was lucky enough to find a question that stuck with me through graduate school. And I am very happy that I found a career that lets me marry both professional and research interests. So that's a little bit about me. How about you, Chris?
Look, I started off as a young PhD grad last century, but without knowing anything about international education practice. I was, purely had an intellectual interest, and started off doing research on how technology was being used in cross-border delivery of mainly Australian programs being delivered in Southeast Asia. And I was attracted to that idea because I didn't know it existed. So it was kind of exactly the opposite from practitioner research in some sense. And then over time, through my career, I've been involved in running international programs, so setting up exchange agreements, running faculty-led study tours and organising a lot of those sorts of relationships. And so I've become much more interested in the practice and research on practice. And I mean, in recent years, when I supervised PhD students quite a bit, and most of the people doing PhDs in the field are coming from a practitioner background and doing research. And so I'm really, really interested in that intersection, and the way that research informs practice and policy, I think is really important. And I try to make sure that all the research I'm involved with actually has a practical outcome or practical uses. But also I'm really interested in the way that the research has informed institutional strategy and national policy. And I think through the International Education Association in Australia, we've been very very committed over a long period of time to trying to use research to shape the national agenda and to shape policy discussion in various ways.
Thank you both. That's especially interesting about shaping national policy, coming from a U.S. perspective. Second question is, I was happily part of the group that got to review the guide in its early stages. Could you both tell us more about what prompted the development of such a guide and why the focus on certain topics rather?
Sure, maybe I'll start on that one. Look, I think both associations have been very active in supporting the research community and trying to create these links between practice and research. So that's been a long-standing interest. I mean, was it last year, the year before? Maybe there was an event at an NAFSA conference where representatives from the research sort of teams from NAFSA, IEAA, and I think EAIE, and maybe the South African organisation as well, were comparing notes on what we do and the types of the ways we support research, and particularly early career researchers and practitioners moving into research. And this was identified, I think, as a bit of a gap at the time, something that we thought would be very useful. And so it came out of that sort of collaboration between our associations. And I think it's the first time maybe, or one of the first times that NAFSA and IEAA have collaborated. And we've been keen on these sorts of partnerships between associations for quite a while. So I think that's a little bit of where it came from. Yeah, but maybe Shanna, you can add
As
more.
Chris mentioned, it did kind of come out as the brainchild of the presentation at the 2019 NAFSA annual conference that happened in DC. But there were also conversations going on within our memberships saying we have practitioners and scholar practitioners that want to connect more with the research and connect it to their practice. This has been an ongoing conversation with different members. So this was really an effort to address that and provide an important resource to our members. And regarding the second half of your question about why we focused on certain topics rather than others, we wanted this guide to be used by scholar practitioners, not necessarily those that are familiar with all the research aspects. So if you've already done a research-focused degree, graduate studies, undergraduate, any of that, you might already have the training necessary to formulate a research question or find funding or know how you want to disseminate and share your findings. For others, you might want some practical guidance. So in writing this guide, Chris and I collaborated and really wrote it together at the beginning of this year in order to address those practical aspects, not to provide another 300-page research guide of what research is and, you know, how to do qualitative research or how to do quantitative research or mixed methods. going into data analysis, all of that. We wanted to provide concrete guidance for people that need something in a digestible format, and that's how this guide came about. So we do have plenty of references to other opportunities, including future training for those that want it, but we didn't want to make a 300-page guide. For one, that's a lot of writing. For two, that would be a lot of reading. So we tried to make something more compact, but definitely more practical.
And I think in both of our organisations, we've seen through all of the events that we run, we see practitioners presenting research, presenting best practice, and presenting their experience. And I think we know from being involved in the sector for a while, there's a quite dynamic interplay between that sort of research and sharing the research in events like the ones we organise and publications like the ones that we publish. That feeds into practice. So you see a range of practitioners and scholars who are very kind of dynamic and where practice is evolving really quickly. And then you see other areas which aren't integrated into those networks of flows of information. And so I think we're constantly looking for ways to help new people enter into that world of sharing practice and but also engaging in the research that others do.
Yes, I recall when I was chair of TLS, there were a lot of questions from the members about the how-to. It's great to hear that, Chris, you talked about a gap that was identified, and also I think your story about coming from maybe a different discipline or the complexity of it, and Shanna talking about what it is that she was hearing from the members. And I love that it's a collaboration between the two associations. So it isn't just a US or focused perspective, but it's also Australia and others. And so given that our membership is worldwide, so really hats off to both of you for bringing it into a reality. I'd be curious to know, as authors and as you were writing this, what do you view as success for the guide? How do you expect people to use it? And what do you hope people...
This one. So what we hope is that individuals in international education that may not have considered the opportunity of sharing their program assessments or student evaluations or outcomes outside of their own institutions, we hope that they can then share their findings with others in different formats, maybe at our conferences, maybe in academic work, maybe on blogs, but we want to help people get their information out because that information ultimately affects best practices in our field. So we want to have this guide impact future knowledge by empowering all of our members to, embrace the scholar-practitioner role, whether they might identify more with scholar or might identify more as practitioner. We really want to help them bridge that gap and have that necessary discussion. Chris, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think we're aiming at really, aren't we, at people who want to move into research and who have ideas and a passion and some curiosity, and maybe have something to share, but not quite sure how to begin that. And so we've focused on the key questions that people have when they're beginning research into practice in the field. And I mean, I guess we all talk to people who have a really rich experience from having run programs or being involved in programs and have learned a lot and want to share that, but not quite sure how to do that. We have others who are people who are doing PhDs, who maybe have no connection with practice and want to move into applying what they've learned in their PhDs into practice and so on. And so I think for all those people, I think for me, the test of this guide is whether it actually gets used by those people and whether it helps people to make that transition into doing practical research in the field. And I think already the response to the guide's been great. I think. I mean, people. I think we've maybe hit that sweet spot of not replicating all of the research guides that are out there. So we don't explain how to do a survey and how to do interviews and the sort of general topics, but the guide's very much focused on the issues that confront professionals moving between your day job of running programs and then reflecting on them, and those sorts of technical issues about what am I allowed to publish based on what I know, like what access can I share from the access that I have to information, what are the kind of privacy and institutional rules, what sort of research makes sense for me to do, and I think it's whether it contributes to helping those decisions is the test, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm hearing the importance of it for our institutions or our own, day-to-day work, but also across the field. And hearing that people really want to share in some of the open meetings where we are in some of these association meetings, finding out, oh, you're doing research in that too, I am too. Or there are a lot of people that, as we've heard, really want to get into it but don't know how or where, and I would just encourage everyone to think about this guide, and now is a great time to really jump into it. I think especially in higher education today, this kind of applied research and data, quantitative or qualitative, is so important as things are changing. I have another question. How has the process of writing the guide influenced your thinking about research in and
should I start on that one? I think, look, it's been a really interesting experience writing. I think the idea to write the guide began before the pandemic, didn't it? And so we began, I think, just before the lockdown in Australia in March, from memory, the first one. And so we had planned to do it all virtually by, sharing a document and writing it at the same time in Google Docs, I think we used initially, and, having regular video conferences. But as time went on this year, that way of working became more and more normal, didn't it? And so really, I think it's been a great lesson in the ways that the current environment where we're all working remotely can actually make international collaboration much easier, because it's very similar now to the way we work locally with our colleagues online. And look, I think we had what did we learn? I think it was really useful for us to have a steering group, or a kind of a group around us who were keeping Shanna and I kind of on the right track, giving us feedback along the way, and also cracking the whip when necessary and keeping us moving along. And I think that's really important for research. And if I think about my research and where the projects that have been successful and the projects that are just, fizzled out after a while, it's that lack of a kind of steering group and a management group, somebody on my back who's actually managing the project. And I think that that's been really, I think, a critical thing, of having that group of people around us who are people who know our target audience very well and able to feed into the process as we're working. And so we did a lot of consultation along the way. We tested ideas, lots of people read drafts. And so I think that, I guess that combination of having a kind of tight-knit kind of management structure, well, it was very loose, but it worked very well, and consultation, regularly getting feedback, I think those two things were really significant, what I learned. What do you think, Shanna?
The process of writing something like this in 2020 has definitely affected different facets of my professional practice, because what I've come to respect for all international educators and in other fields is that there are many demands on our time, and often we're asked to do more with less. And, you know, that's in many fields. It's not just higher ed or international ed. But the impetus behind this guide was trying to provide guidance to, as I said before, empower people, not to limit them or to put restrictions on people, but really to provide the information to overcome some of those challenges that we are all faced with. From the polls below, actually one of the top responses for, you know, what is one of your biggest challenges to doing research is actually finding time. And for us, well, for me at least, writing this guide was part of my day job. So I did have time during the day, but I know for Chris, it was something in addition to what he was already doing and teaching students and everything. So it's made me more aware of those things, but it's also made me more appreciative of those who are able to summarize research in a concise and clear way that is easily digestible for others. You know, 2-3 years ago, I would be reading the OECD report that is usually about 200 pages long, the Education at a Glance. And the international education section is really small, and it mainly talks about student mobility. But now in a post-COVID world or current COVID world, there are so many different ways to think about mobility and think about international partnerships and different arrangements for international education. So really what I think writing this guide has given me is more hope for our future, because there are different avenues that we can take. And there are also different ways that people can get engaged with research. And hopefully we can highlight some of those.
Great points for the future of international education, especially post-COVID, as you've mentioned. Those are the few questions that I have. We'll be starting the Q&A portion right now, so share your questions in the Q&A box if you haven't already started. And let's see, I can see in the poll that finding time is a common impediment to engaging with research. What recommendations do the panelists have about making time for research? And I would just footnote, especially if...
Shanna, did you want to start, or will I?
You can go ahead and start.
Sure. Okay. So I think, I mean, in the guide, we touch on this, and I guess we differentiate between making research your core business, so making that part of what your day job is, and then doing research on the side. And I think, and often it's a combination of those things, isn't it? Because I'm a faculty member, so research is technically part of my day job. It's what I'm expected to do in my role, and yet it always seems to be the last thing that gets done, and it's done on weekends and evenings and early in the mornings and so on. So it's not necessarily a clear distinction. But I think for practitioners, there's an opportunity in, I guess, moving from a purely practice orientation to a kind of reflective practice, and then publishing or producing some insights within your organization that kind of reflect on what you're doing, sharing that within the organization, and then kind of, I guess, building up some expertise in that kind of reflective practice, and then publishing, maybe presenting at conferences some of the work that you're doing and some of the insights learned from that practice. And I guess building up to getting a reputation in the organization for someone who can speak about practice and research and publish and so on. And I think if you look at a lot of people who've made that transition into sort of practitioner research, it's kind of being built up over time with kind of gradually building expertise and getting some kind of license from managers to take on more of that role as part of a professional job. And so I think there's there's that, but it's tricky to do, isn't it? It's tricky to convince a manager that this is worthwhile use of my time. And I might have to do less of something else because I'm presenting a conference paper. And so I think being able to sell the benefits of that kind of research to the organization, and both in terms of the internal benefits to the organization, what we've learned through what we've done and how we can improve things, but also the benefits of profiling your organization, being able to present on behalf of your organization in public, and the sort of external recognition that comes from that sort of public engagement is really valuable.
I echo everything that Chris has said.
Great points. And I was going to ask another question. I think Chris answered it, but Shanna, you might have some additional things. Where is a good starting point for those who are just beginning their journey towards embracing research?
And then hopefully Chris can chime in. So one of the best places to start is look at what you're interested in or what you're already involved in. As Chris mentioned, getting buy-in from senior leadership, from your direct manager or supervisor might take a bit, but it's also your professional development. So for me, it has been crucial that I've looked at topics that I was already involved in. So in a former life, it was looking at international students' experiences at the universities I was at. I was already working with those populations, and it was how to better serve those students. In my current role, it's how to help international educators connect research to practice on a daily basis. And in that, I represent NAFSA. So for those that are interested in starting a journey into research, I would look at what information you have available and what your key responsibilities are, and see if you have questions that need answering. I'm sure we all do, but there are different ways to answer those questions, and then share those findings with others. Like Chris mentioned, it could be writing something, it could be presenting, it could be social engagement, especially anything related to policy. And in international education, we have a lot of work that is better used for advocacy purposes. So it's not to put yourself into a box, but open up opportunities. I would start with the questions you have.
Yeah, and if I can just add on to that, I think there's two ways of thinking about the types of questions that we tackle, and one is thinking about what information we have access to and what resources we have access to. And so many practitioners have a wealth of data available to them and insights from their experience, which and often that prompts the research questions, and we want to share what we know. But then coming from the other point of view, there's gaps in our knowledge, things that we realize through doing stuff that we might have run a program intuitively, but then really have lots of questions about its impacts and how other people are doing it, and realizing that there's not actually much known about the effectiveness of practice in this space. And so I guess it's there's often the practice reveals gaps in the literature and gaps in knowledge, which then motivate us to go out and try and answer those questions for ourselves. But often, if you find through running a program and then looking for the research that will inform what you're doing, that there's actually not that much that's that helpful for practitioners in some topics, and particularly in innovative areas of practice and emerging fields. I think at the moment there's probably a lot of people curious about what's the best way to run a webinar, for example. We're doing these sorts of webinars. There's lots of different experimentation, different formats. Has there been any evaluation of what sort of formats of webinars work in international contexts? And, that's something where the practice is kind of running ahead of the research maybe. And I think in our fields, because there is a lot of innovation, there's a lot of people experimenting with things and then wanting to kind of investigate how well they're working. Yeah.
Thank you. I have another question here from Christiana. How can emerging scholar practitioners use their experience to secure research grants and funding? I feel like I have ideas, but I'm not an academic, which often leaves me feeling unqualified in spite of my background. Do you have any suggestions?
Will I start on that one maybe? I think, yeah, so there is a section here on funding and resources where we talk about internal resources within organizations, competitive grant schemes and so on. And I think, I mean, it's often for small projects and initiating research, it's sometimes easier to get allocations of resources of time and small amounts of money internally to do sort of small pilot projects. For large research grants, you're right, as a practitioner or as a professional staff member, it's often difficult to get access to those sorts of funds, and they are targeted towards researchers and faculty members. But I think that, and so for applying for those bigger grants, collaboration becomes really important. So collaboration between practitioners who understand the needs and what the questions are, what we know and what we don't, and researchers or sort of faculty members who have a publication track record, a record of getting grants and are able to apply and get those sorts of funds. I think, and bringing together teams which combine that sort of expertise, both of sort of research specialists and practical specialists, is really important. And so we talk a bit about how to build a team, recognizing what sort of expertise you need and who you need in the tent for different types of projects. And of course, it's going to differ every time you start doing a project. You've got to think through, all right, who do we need here? But I think in that question about getting grants and applying for grants, unfortunately, the best indicator of whether someone's going to get funded is whether they've been funded before. So you need to look around and see who's got a good track record of winning those competitive grants and try and collaborate with them in some ways. And that's it's tricky to do, but when you manage to find people that where there's a connection and people gel, then that can be really effective. Shanna, do you have anything to add on that question of how to generate resources and so funding for projects?
Yeah, so there are, as you mentioned, there's an entire section about accessing funding and different sources. There is also an option that is a little easier rather than looking at national grants, especially if it's something internal. You could look at institutional grants. Most academic institutions do have institutional grants. There may also be association grants or different research opportunities where there are calls for proposals. And I would look into those to start with, and definitely check out the section in the guide where we cover it and provide some hyperlink sources to it too.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, I mean, it's really important to look at small parcels of funding, and I guess if you have a research program, an idea about a program, all right, here's the type of research we want to do, and almost having the projects kind of designed, or at least to some extent ready to go, so that when there's a little bit of money or a little bit of time, you can bite off part of it and kind of moving ahead with little incremental stages rather than waiting for a huge grant in order to start. And I think often the effective collaborations kind of begin with little lots of little pieces which then build over time. And it's much easier to get those started. But I think also thinking about what we can do now with what we've got, rather than waiting for a grant. And so starting with the available resources and biting something off. And often, that will lead to publishing something, a small part of things, which will then, the fact of having a successful collaboration, having published something on the topic, it then makes it much easier to get subsequent funding, either from the organization you work for, like showing them that there is actually a positive outcome from you spending time on things, and generating that sort of more support for your work within the organization, but also applying for external grants. If you've been able to achieve little bits and pieces and a track record of collaboration and publishing, that can really help.
Yeah, I've been quite surprised by a lot of the private foundations too that are really interested in evidence and research that really speaks to future skills, or current for that matter, related to global mindset or other things. So it's also, I think, just being transferable, transferring kind of what it is that we're doing internally to our institutions more broadly as well. Jeff says there's a growing number of journals that publish research on the learning outcomes associated with different teaching pedagogies, driving evidence-based teaching. Are there similar outlets for international education faculty and professionals to publish co-authored?
Yeah.
Shanna, do you want to begin on this one?
I can start. There are a number of journals for specifically international education. And again, I'm going to reference the guide because we have a section about journals. Some of the key parts that I would like to highlight right now, though, are the Journal of Studies in International Education, of which both NAFSA and IEAA support. There's also the Journal of Research in International Education, the Journal of Higher Education, Research in Higher Education. All of those usually will have tracks for international educators. Even if they're a higher education or general education journal, they are interested in international education research. Depending on the scope of the journal, it might be a 5,000 word article, it could be a 10,000 word article. And as always, we always need to keep an eye on what citation managers they want, or no citation managers. APA, MLA, you name the alphabet soup of citations. But there are a lot of journals out there, depending on your specialty. You could look at pedagogy and assessment specific journals, or if it's something more general, you might want to look in that area. But we do have, again, links within the guide that highlight different opportunities that we think are especially useful. Chris, did you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, there's I guess a special note for the Journal of Studies in International Education, which is a journal that's owned by the professional association, so by NAFSA, IEAA, and the other sort of our counterpart organisations around the world have this journal, which has a commitment to informing practice. And has a very high, in terms of scholarly sort of citation rates and so on, has been really influential and very successful as a scholarly journal, but also has that connection back to the associations. And look, I think while I'm a faculty member and I publish in journals a bit, I think it's worth thinking about more industry-focused and practitioner-focused outlets as well. And there's a bit of information about this in the guide. So I think publishing, presenting at conferences with other practitioners in the room is really important. Producing, these days blog posts often have a lot more impact than journal articles, to be honest. A short piece that's very insightful, that gets to the right people at the right time, is likely to have much more impact than a journal article, which takes 10 times or 20 times as much effort to produce and write, and might take a year between writing and then publication, and by the time it's published, the time's passed. And so I think those sorts of opportunities for immediate or quick publication are worth thinking about. I mean, our associations have lots of opportunities to publish practice guides, research digests, and so on, and magazine articles and all of our regular periodicals and so on. And so thinking about those, for any research that we do, thinking about, right, how do I get the findings out in different formats for different audiences in different ways, and but I wouldn't underestimate those sorts of shorter and more practice-oriented articles for impact.
Thank you, Shanna and Chris, and thank you everyone for all of your questions. I'm wondering if Chris and Shanna, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Sure, I can go ahead and start. I'd invite everybody to reach out to us, reach out to other NAFSANs, reach out to Chris with IEAA, reach out to me, research@nafsa.org, with questions. We have various ways within the guide and outside, that you can get more involved and ask questions. Sometimes it's connecting you with others, whether that be through the Research Connections Network or sharing ideas and trends and insights. We have various opportunities within our organizations to involve members and help you get your voices out. So I hope everyone finds the guide useful, and just wanted to say thank you.
Great, and yeah, likewise, I'd echo all those sentiments. And with the International Education Association of Australia, there's a mailing list. I think on the research page you can subscribe to our email list. We have research events and publications, and the benefit of the lockdown now is that most of those are available to anybody anywhere in the world, so you don't have to be in Australia to access our resources, and vice versa, which is a wonderful thing. So I think we're seeing that flourishing of the internationalization of the conference and seminar circuit, aren't we, where it's much easier to participate internationally now. Look, I'd encourage people to if you have interest in research and ideas, to begin reaching out to people who you might want to work with, and who might, because often it takes a group of people in order to get anything off the ground, and so there's a lot of kind of feeling the waters at the beginning of any research project, and trying out ideas, testing ideas with people, and I think there's a lot of trial and error in working out who you can talk to, who you can write with, who you can be inspired by, who you can get things finished with, and the format. And I think there's a lot of trial and error in doing that. And but I think it's worth going through that process to find the people who you work well with, and often it's unpredictable, and who you're going to collaborate with really effectively. But I think it's got to be an enjoyable and rewarding experience. And if somebody's not that, if you don't look forward to getting onto a call with somebody about a work meeting, and it's on top of your day job, it's not going to persist very long, is it? So I think finding that sense of spark and reward in the people you collaborate with is really important, and that's going to sustain you through that research journey, I think. I think hopefully the guide will help in kind of giving tools and ideas about how to start that process, and who to reach out to, and how to form these teams.
Well, thank you both for putting together this important resource. Elaine from our audience says, just want to thank all of you and your contributors for pursuing this project and publication. It's a wonderful resource, and I wish it had been available years back during my own doctoral research experience. It will help individuals and the field to progress in our profession. So thank you. Well put. I think that's a great way to finalize our session today. A recording of the event will be made available soon. And please mark your calendars for Friday, November 20th for the Fall 2020 Research Symposium during NAFSA's International Education Week Campus Connection. I know, Shanna, you're leading that effort, so thank you for that. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, Shanna, again, and we hope to see all of you soon. Take good care, everybody.
Bye.